Hello, everyone, and welcome to this final session of the Congress, in fact, which is titled Money is Power, Financing Aid in a More Just Future. So I'm going to introduce myself and then introduce you to the excellent panelists that we have with us today. So first of all, my name is Lydia Poole. I'm an independent consultant specialising in financing, aid financing in crises in particular. And I'm going to just make a few opening remarks to frame the discussion today and then introduce you to the rest of our panelists here. So just to note that the themes of this session, which are focused very much on money and power in humanitarian aid, I think have provided us with an excellent framing for some really challenging discussion, which this selection of panelists, I think, will be able to provide some really interesting and fresh insights on. My contention on this issue is related to the formal process which has attempted to reform the ways in which money flows through the international humanitarian financing system, which you're probably most familiar with as the localization agenda. And particularly, you might be familiar with it through the grand bargain process. So my contention with regard to this formal attempt to reform the system is that by their own metrics, this attempt to reform has already failed. And the numbers are pretty unequivocal on that by their own assessment. So still only about 3.1% of international humanitarian funding has reached local and national actors directly at the latest year for which we have data in 2020, which is a far cry from the 25% which was originally imagined in this ambitious target that was set at the beginning of the grand bargain process. So I think the reason why this has struggled so much is because the commitments that were set sought to address issues around access to the money through a range of technical fixes, but they really did nothing to directly challenge or dismantle the prevailing systems of power. Which functions sort of like any other patronage system, really, where access to money is most reliably secured through personal relationships, historic ties, and obligations. So what we saw with this formal attempt to reform was that as soon as the grand bargain signatories broke out into their work streams and tried to make sense of how they were going to deliver on these commitments, it became pretty clear that donors didn't actually have any real intention, or perhaps if we're being generous, any ability to really increase their funding directly to local and national actors. So they ended up finessing their understanding of the wording, which enabled them to effectively continue reproducing the same system of channeling funding through international intermediaries. So in some ways, that's probably placed an even greater responsibility on the funding intermediary, which is completely contrary to what the original challengers of this whole process had imagined. And I think the only time that status quo was really challenged in this whole process was probably an accident, when the consultation process that led into the World Humanitarian Summit provided a platform for local and national actors for the first time to engage directly with policy and decision makers. And that's really where this set of commitments really came from, that their voice was so consistent and clear on these feelings of frustration around being relegated to contractors and having so little voice and influence in decision making. Just became too loud and too consistent to ignore. So if the formal approach to reforming and rebalancing power and resources within the system has stumbled, and we've failed to really dismantle the system of power in any meaningful way, I'd say fortunately, outside of the formal process, there are much more encouraging practical examples of efforts to try to distribute power and resources in different ways that are more equitable and just. So today we've got with us three really inspiring and challenging speakers who've got direct experience through their own organisations of trying to achieve a more fair distribution of power and money. So if I just briefly run through who we have with us today, and then I'm going to turn to each of them to tell us a bit about their experience in these areas. So first of all, we have Chair Wen DeWitt, who is the Director of Partnerships at the Siegel Family Foundation. And we have Lydia Sugomo, who is the Global Programs Director at Oxfam International, and also Sudhanshu Singh, who is the founder and CEO of Humanitarian Aid International, which is an organization based in India. And many of you may be familiar also with Sudhanshu, who's involved in, I think, pretty much every campaign and network involved in trying to push on the localization agenda. And his organization, I believe, is also host to the A4EP network, which is the Alliance for Empowering Partnerships. So I'm going to ask each of our panelists to talk to us a little bit about their own experience, and then also we'll have an open question and answer session at the end if we have time, but also please do feel free to drop your questions into the chat function, and we'll try our best to feed those into the discussion as we go. So first of all, if I could turn to you, Sherwan, you mentioned in the discussion that we had yesterday before this session that the Siegel Family Foundation is already convinced of the why, around why it's important to support local organisations, and you are now fully focused on the how of how we actually achieve that. And your approach to supporting civil society partners reads like a funding recipient's dream. There's all sorts of things like having long-term relationships, flexible funding, unburdensome reporting, celebrating your partners, investing in capacity strengthening and networking. But you also work to influence other foundations in how they approach working with civil society. So I wonder if you could start by telling us a bit about what you have learned from your own experiences over the last few years that might be useful to try and convince other donors to work in this way.
Thank you, Lydia, and and thank you to the Humanitarian Congress for hosting this conversation. Yeah, and on your question, I think I would share a few key learnings from our team's process that has turned what was formerly made up of nearly 100% foreign-led organizations to one that is now over 3/4 local organizations. And first, I would say just start. Start funding local organizations and don't spend 2 or 3 years coming up with a complex framework or a 20-point checklist. And know that there is no amount of planning that will prevent you from making mistakes. You will certainly make them. We are already making them, but you will learn valuable lessons along the way. So essentially, don't inadvertently procrastinate this process by submitting yourself to a form of analysis paralysis. And I think in that process, it's really important for funders and funding institutions to be willing to name the problems at the root of this issue, which are racism and personal bias. We have lots of white papers that describe the kind of technical challenges to this at length, but if we don't directly address this, it will be impossible to solve for it at a systemic level or at a team level or even an interpersonal level. And I think the last thing I would say is that our transition in this area has been successful largely because of the decision to not only hire a completely local grant-making team, but to shift all strategic and grant-making power to them. So for our foundation, that means all grant decisions about Kenyan organizations are made in Kenya by Kenyans, in Malawi by Malawians, et cetera. And so once you work on one layer of localization, it of course reveals another to work on and another, whether it's the organizations you work with, the staff of your own funding team, your foundation board, the consultants you work with. We really emphasize the prioritization of local professionals in every aspect of our work.
Thank you. That's really interesting, and I think you've already set a challenge for us today in mentioning and calling out some of the really most difficult to talk about issues in this process. So you talked already about racism and personal bias in this whole power structure, and I'm hoping that that's going to come out more in the discussion. But yeah, thanks for just bringing that up right at the start of the discussion. So I thought actually it might be interesting to talk to Lydia next about Oxfam International's experience, because as an intermediary organisation who has worked with local partners for many years, and I should say that many of the larger and more successful local national actors that I've encountered over the years have often been nurtured in their early years through partners like Oxfam. So Oxfam has a kind of a long long history and strong credentials in working as a partner organisation, but it's also kind of shifted that approach quite significantly, I think, in the last few years. And I think partly perhaps driven through necessity, through your own funding crunch. But nevertheless, that process has taken a different direction and sped up. And in 2020, for example, I understand that Oxfam actually phased out of 18 countries and handed over some of its programme there to local and national partners. So I wonder if you could tell us a bit about some of the lessons and experiences from that process of, I guess, sort of trying to step out of the way and shift power in Oxfam's relationships with its local and national partners. So perhaps you could tell us about some of the benefits, but also some of the challenges and areas of resistance that the organisation has encountered in that process.
Thanks very much, Lydia. I would start by saying that when you're looking at Oxfam's journey, it's both an internal journey as well as an external journey. There are two parts to it, and it's always important to remember that to be a good partner, we must be a good partner internally amongst ourselves, because Oxfam is a confederation, and with country programs who in the main are the main agencies of partnering with local and national partners, as well as then how we show up and relate with external partners. So it's been it's always on a two phase or parallel process that's been going on within Oxfam. And what's interesting for me based on your question, is two things. One, I was actually in my first journey in the development sector a partner myself. The national organization I ran in Zimbabwe was actually one of the partners of Oxfam. And at the time, Oxfam was still operating with a number of different affiliate-run operations in national geographies, and made a deliberate decision to change that into having what we call a one Oxfam approach, so that the experience also of partners would be with one Oxfam rather than multiple Oxfams, while maintaining its confederation identity. And one of the things I think that's important to note is that internal journey has meant that there are major changes internally in Oxfam, in our governance, in our leadership, in our staff, and in our ways of working. Those are important because they're also in turn opening up space for partners to be more intimately engaged with Oxfam. So it's not just about an external relationship, but how partners are able to influence us and hold us to account internally in our internal affairs by bringing them into some of the spaces, for instance, like the stakeholder assembly, etc., that are part of the governance structure of Oxfam. So the intention is deliberately to keep opening the spaces. The second part of it, in terms of the external, which we're talking about in relation to phasing out of the 18 countries, I think has the lessons that have come from that is clear issues. So we're still in the process, by the way. The process ends at the end of this year. The decision was made last year. And what is interesting about it is issues around did we have an exit strategy from the time we went in the first place? Because one of the things that comes out of that is the shock to the system, naturally, of staff, and many of them are national staff the majority are usually national staff in the country offices which are being phased out. Now, the phasing out is of our physical presence. That is our infrastructure, our branded name and offices, and our employing directly national staff in that country. And it's also giving us an opportunity to interrogate how well our partnership model was actually working with our external partners. Because what's also interesting has been that in many countries, the initial reaction by many partners was fear, concern, even a request to reverse the decision, which also speaks to some issues around, were we creating a dependency syndrome, where partners also felt that they could not have an existence independent of the existence of Oxfam physically in their borders. But increasingly, as we've moved on the journey, people have begun to see that from a place of what they considered as loss, there's also gain, because it's challenging the idea that for a partnership to exist, you must have this whole infrastructure existing in that country to manage those partnerships. And also, it's even challenging even that language, because from we are an organization that's deliberately also acknowledging our colonial history and trying to change. And that's what was part of the Southernization agenda within Oxfam. So why do we need to manage partners? Are they not independent, autonomous organizations? So it's causing us to question with the partners a whole lot of language and approaches that were seen as normal, natural, and part of the development sector, and begin to think differently. And I think that is important. And we haven't finished that journey. So I was in meetings last week and this week through to next week, where we're talking with board members, with executive directors around, do we fully yet even understand partnership? We've made all these commitments around our, how much we're going to spend through partners, etc., and give to partners. What is it revealing? What is our own data revealing about how we've been supporting partners? Have we mainly been projectizing? Is there potential that we've been instrumentalizing partners? Have we really been about coming alongside, as our historical part of our historical background was about being in solidarity with people rather than taking over their issues for them? So how do we manage that fine line of becoming the savior, and as opposed to an organization that is working for and in solidarity with these partners? So a lot of these things are coming in, and I must say also personally, internally, it's challenging all our biases. So I really want to support Chairwoman on what she said, because we've discovered that all of us biases and prejudices, and we have to kind of consciously face them and begin to actually unpack them. And unpacking them means understanding how power and privilege works internally and also externally, including with our partners. So the journey is still on. I'll stop there for now, but these are some of the quick things I can say about what we've been learning.
Thank you so much. And I think that also leads us really nicely into the questions that I've got for Sudhanshu, particularly this point around partnering, creating potentially dependency, and perhaps, so the questions that might raise around the types of civil society that you are then cultivating, and whether that's ultimately what any of us would aspire to. So Sudhanshu, you set up your own organization in India after a long career working with international organizations, and you've also been very actively involved in the localization agenda for many years across many different platforms, where much of the discussion has been focused on these issues around access to international funding, but you had a very different vision for your own organization. So you, as I understand it, have largely opted for independence of funding from big international donors. So I wondered if you could tell us a bit about your approach to building a more sustainable and independent funding base for your organization that doesn't rely on it being a client to international partners and donors, and maybe some of the lessons around what you've learned, the benefits of that, and what some of the challenges that you've encountered along the way have been.
Thank you, Lydia. It's never easy. I've been working in this sector since 88, so it's almost 33 long years, and until 2015 I was into jobs, and I worked within India, internationally, with national organizations, mostly international organizations, and quite a few faith-based organizations. I was part of various reform processes, etc. And then every time I was getting engaged in this process, every time I was involved in a response to a mega disaster, it was disappointing. It brought more disillusionment to me from the global architecture. Means I realized that it's very, very disempowering for local and national actors. No, see, most of the countries in global South had very vibrant civil society movement. No, most of them that has started waning away, because you see, since the time this global architecture, particularly after the two world wars, started growing, started getting stronger and more institutionalized global funding mechanism started emerging, and that is very, very counterproductive to domestic civil society movement. So this is what I was experiencing, that if there is a disasters mostly 67% approximately occur in global south, but almost all the so-called funding agencies, INGOs, intermediaries are located based in Europe or North America. And when they appear on the scene, they don't come as a supporter, as aid worker. They come as superior, who know, as saviors, no, who have to dictate, who have to prescribe what to do, who have to allocate fund, and who have to tell instead of listen. No, despite all the discourses and diagnosing the problem exactly, it's very, very hard for all these actors to walk the talk. And that's why and there was by a bit of Indianness also in me, which was seeing all the international organizations appearing and working in different countries in Asia and Africa, by dominating local organizations. And I was thinking, why can't we come up with an Indian organization also working, trying to work outside India? Uh, I also realized that this funding mechanism is very bureaucratic, and it's very, very slow. It's often very frustrating. If people need food today, the bureaucracy takes 3-4 weeks to deliver food aid to them. No, so for all these reasons, I thought that let me go back to my country and establish my own organization, which is informed but disconnected from international, not dependent upon global aid architecture, so that we can bring in operational efficiency, bring in Indian pride also, because it will be primarily supported by Indians, whether living in India or outside. So with that mission on mind, I returned to India and founded this organization in 2016. I think we have been reasonably successful in that, despite all the challenges, because India is a very unique case. This is one of the fastest growing economies. Europe, most of the countries have slowed down, so all the traditional aid agencies are looking for fresh markets. I'll be talking more later on this, but it has been, I know from my personal experience that it's never going to be easy for an Indian organization to grow, even within India. We try to sustain our organization on the basis of crowdfunding, corporate funding available in India, not seeking international funding, because international funding, if it comes with a lot of strings attached. No, it is very humiliating. I have experienced that even if you start going through the due diligence process, it is very humiliating. It looks like that you are a thief, and you have to prove all the point that you are not going to steal any money. No, it's very, very disempowering, frustrating, and humiliating. And against all that experience, I have been trying to build this organization based on Indian resources, Indianness, Indian value system, Indian civil society organizations movement, and it's not easy. I'll tell more about that later, Lydia. Thank you.
Thanks so much. I think lots of really interesting and challenging themes emerging already, and particularly this point that I think both Lydia and Sudhanshu have raised about the potential harms that we do to civil society, to the health of civil society, and the independence and sustainability, sometimes inadvertently through our funding approaches, which is interesting because I think a lot of international actors tend to assume that there is a capacity building element involved in the funding process. And that perspective might not be shared by local national actors themselves. There's also, I guess, one more quite difficult to talk about dynamic amongst international and national NGOs, which is this element of competition for resources. So that in many cases, international NGOs will, it's not really a level playing field, and international NGOs have many more resources and experience with the systems and processes that allow them to easily or outcompete local national actors who may potentially actually be programmatically and in terms of access better suited to respond. Often outcompete in terms of having proposal writing teams and marketing and fundraising budgets and slick branding and so on. And the grand bargain in some ways has perhaps placed even greater emphasis on the role of the intermediary and created more incentives perhaps for internationals to compete for this role of being the funding intermediary. So it makes it even more difficult in a way to step aside and let go. International organisations have their own kind of survival dynamics and need to raise funds to sustain their operations and staffing levels. It's a pretty powerful motivator to want to keep your staff in jobs, actually, and that's something that a lot of managers will recognise that pressure, but that does feed into this whole competition dynamic between organisations. So I wondered, and I addressed this to all of you, but perhaps starting with Lydia, what do you think that international organisations need to do in order to step aside and let go, and how do you start that process? And are there any kind of practical examples that you could point to, perhaps where we could look at alternative models where we might be collaborating rather than competing?
Yeah. When I'm answering this, I'm actually debating in my mind about whether it's how to better phrase it than step aside. I think let go is important, but step aside might also be problematic. And why do I say that? It's because if I look at the way the financial architecture is composed, I think one thing that INGOs and donors in general need to come into the humanitarian sector with is humility, because it's, as we know, the data is very clear that of official humanitarian aid, that's going to countries who are in need and responding to humanitarian crisis, only about 1%. The actual ways in which responses are supported in majority of cases is by the countries and their own governments and local governments, etc., and their own citizens, often citizens living abroad. So we do need to actually understand how money flows within these countries to respond to situations that are rising. And increasingly in many countries, also citizens in the country themselves actually starting drives to support in cash and kind humanitarian responses. And of course, everyone who's gone to a humanitarian disaster has been able to see that the first responders are actually the neighboring communities themselves, with practically no financial resources, giving support to those who are families in distress because of the crisis that has befallen them. So I think we do need to come with some humility into that space and understanding that those dynamics. But I think that what's also interesting is that the way in which the sector works is that, and that's why I was saying I'm debating the step aside. It's not step aside and leave everything without contributing to creating a better dynamic. So the role of INGOs around being a better intermediary is around brokering and facilitating, and that part I think is still important. We found, for instance, in the COVID response, COVID crisis, pandemic, that while and actually I hear this many times when I'm visiting certain countries, and I won't name them, and talking to government officials, how they are still so suspicious of their own local organizations, NGOs and national NGOs. It's a very sad reality. It's part of the dynamic of what we've created around the politics of development. And sometimes it's because maybe that particular government in power is not necessarily representative of all the peoples, the different people groups that are existing. And NGOs, by their nature, are also a response by local communities and organizations and leaders, civic society leaders, to an issue that they're seeing on the ground, that they're coming together and saying, I'm starting something because I need to respond to this situation that I'm seeing. So they also come with a particular value proposition and background that is either accepted or not accepted by the governing structures. So what I have found is the ability of INGOs sometimes to do that mediating and brokering, to facilitate governments who are very suspicious of their NGOs for whatever political reasons are at play, to actually begin to understand that NGOs are partners for development of their own countries. So I think that role is important. Internally within NGOs, the intermediary role does require and has required us to look at things like how flexible is the money that we are also passing on to local actors. Our role should be to reduce the bureaucracy around how that money has to be managed and reported upon. Oftentimes we don't. We simply pass on the heaviness of that bureaucracy. But actually, our role should be to shield local and national actors from having to experience the heaviness of that bureaucracy. We absorb it and deal with it and manage that in relation to the donor. And increasingly, that's what we try to do as Oxfam. We don't always succeed, but that's the aim in terms of the ways in which we're trying to work better with partners. And then the other area is we've been challenging ourselves, looking at our own monitoring data about the length of partnerships, the type of money, because remember, money comes in certain forms. The money is in grant restricted, what we call restricted money, that is coming from donors. But NGOs also, in some cases, not all, depending on your funding base, talking about the sustainability issue you're raising, Lydia, some of us have a reasonable amount of what we call unrestricted funding, which either comes from supporters, individual supporters, the campaigning activities that have been done, that have humanitarian appeals, etc., that have meant that money is coming in that is being entrusted to the INGO to pass on to those who are in need. So I think that the importance of looking at the quality of the mix of the funding that is actually being in the end transferred to the partners is important, because while you may not be able to, and I remember during the COVID response, there was a lot of advocacy to the EU and others in terms of how, and the UN in terms of how the money they were making available, because the majority of the money was coming through that system, could be made more directly available to local and national actors. It was a particularly challenging issue because their own bureaucratic mechanisms and systems meant that was in some cases well nigh impossible. So then the issue then becomes, how do we continue to influence changes in the donors? That is the role, I think, again, of NGOs, to be influencing donors, UN, EU, and all bi and multilateral donors, to continue to walk the talk in terms of the things they've also committed to in this space around localization. And then lastly, the risks issue. There's an emerging thing because of all the issues that are happening within the sector around risks. And I just wanted to talk to this briefly, because risks are coming in the form of, we knew aid diversion, that's been there for a couple of decades now, but increasingly safeguarding and safe programming have come in. We've got security, of course, because in many of these environments where humanitarian action is taking place, there are issues of insecurity. And it's important that together with donors, NGOs are fighting hard and advocating around how that risk is shared, not transferred to partners, and how we are understanding the duty of care also in relation to partners, because we must care about it for our own staff, but we must equally care about it for partners. And I think that advocacy should be something that NGOs hold as the intermediary, again, in pushing donors in terms of the fact that we should not be having grants that coming through that are refusing to pay for certain necessary costs that are linked to managing those risks. That should be part and parcel of how this restricted money that flows to many of us in the sector incorporates all those issues and ensures that we're actually also setting partners for success, and including an institutional component on institutional building, because all of us require that. It's not something that is special to partners, and somehow they're less because they're demanding it. Every one of us needs to self-sustain, and to self-sustain, there must be an investment into building our own systems and our own ability to self-sustain, and that should be part and parcel of what funding that's coming to partners should incorporate, not just the response. And I think those are the areas that we've been trying to push around. Later we can talk about some examples of how we've actually done that, but I'll stop there in terms of the general framing.
Thank you so much. I think some really nice kind of practical examples of how greater complementarity can be achieved in the partnership relationship between international and national actors, which is all really positive. I think there are still many areas where externally, outside of a partnership relationship, international and national actors are still very much in competition, and as funding resources potentially shrink in the, I don't know if we can really say post-COVID era, but we're still in it. But as we expect aid budgets in some countries particularly to become quite squeezed, then that competition can only increase. And I know this is an area that Sudhanshu has had some particular insights into, particularly around competition in domestic fundraising markets. That it's one of these areas where, again, it's sort of an area where international actors are following a quite defensible logic from their own organizational perspective, and it might be quite uncomfortable to hear from the other side what that looks like from the perspective of local and national actors, and what the kind of perhaps unintended consequences or perverse outcomes of that might be. So, Sudhanshu, I wondered if you could tell us a bit about your experiences of the competition dynamics in the private fundraising market in India from your experience.
Thank you, Lydia. And I'm mindful of time, and I have quite a few points, so let me try to be very quick. But before I come to my point, I will slightly have different opinion what Lydia said earlier, that governments are suspicious of local organizations. They are. But they are primarily suspicious of local organizations, at least in my experience, because of the international funding they receive. Because most of the southern governments believe that this international funding is coming and going to NGOs to derail their development programs, to support the advocacy which is challenging the government and government's autonomy. So that's the suspicion, and there the international organizations will have to look into that, how they are making the local organizations safer, not creating more risk for them. But otherwise, I largely don't believe that local organizations are suspected for any other reasons. Of course, there are corruption, but that's across. Now, coming to this point, Lydia, I don't think international organizations are creating any competition for us in our domestic market for fundraising, because we are too weak to compete with them. So they are competing with each other. When Europe started growing during the Industrial Revolution, all the European countries were looking for markets in Asia and Africa. So for India was at that time also very attractive. So most of the countries established East India companies, whether it was British or Dutch or Danish or French or Spanish, and all these East India companies arrived from their countries to capture resources in India, and they're competing with each other. Not competing with Indians, no, they are competing, and then eventually all of them got some share. Maximum share went to Great Britain, no. And anyway, we got independence, but now we are again back to the same phase of colonization, where we have World Vision India, Oxfam India, Plan International India, Save the Children India, Action Aid India, Water Aid India, Site Savers India, whatnot India, and they are competing with each other to raise maximum out of India. We don't have that money. We are not means if you refer to this study reports funded by USAID, stopping at success, that glorifies transition of INGOs to NGOs. Most of these INGOs have been funded by one or other European governments to nationalize in Global South. They funded for 1-2 years the transition from international to national. So are we into competition? We start from scratch. Means I am working for the past 5.5 years with my organization, often without any salaries, pro bono, because I don't have money to pay to myself. No, can I compete with INGOs which get millions to support their fundraising, to run advertisements? We can't. So that's why they are not competing. They are just making us extinct even within our own countries, and their country officers very proudly say, oh, we are India, we are Indian. So who are we then? No, and that's the problem. And number two, if the commitment made to 5 years, more than 5 years ago, 25%. That's absurd. Why 25%? But no one knows the logic of it. And even now we have only 3.1%, and that's also guess. We don't know, it could be less also, because there is no financial data in public domain. But my question is, forget about 3% or 25% or whatever. If we just focus how much money all these intermediaries are raising in our own countries, and that's going to open our eyes. And we are not still focusing on that, because that's the area which is disempowering us much more than what we could have got from OECD DAC countries, UN agencies, and leave that aside. Keep 100% of that with you. raise 0% in our countries, and that's going to be game changer. That's not going to happen, and that's why intermediary agencies are closing. If they are closing down the offices, they are closing down in the countries where there is zero possibility of local fundraising, not in India. No, and because in India they need to sustain. Europe is not growing, India is. So this intermediaries need India and other countries like India. And when I often hear this word shifting the power, and I find it very offensive to me. Uh, am I powerless and that I need a power from someone else? I simply don't. What I believe that you are encroaching upon my space, and the only thing what you have to do is vacate our space, and that's it. Stop encroaching upon, and then we can take care of most of this. Before I close, just very quickly about COVID-19. COVID-19, many organizations present as a very good example of localization, because a lot more funding was passed on to local actors. But if we analyze, it was passed on because of travel restrictions and fear of getting exposed to the virus. And that's why local actors were found the best to pass on the risk and in the form of aid. And all the local actors were on ground doing the carrying out relief and vaccine, etc., etc. So many died without having any kind of social security. No, and that's the stark reality of more funds to local organization during COVID-19 response. So we have to look into that. Are we really living up to the vision and mission which we refer to in our websites and annual reports? I stop here, Lydia. Already very provocative.
Thank you. It's really interesting, and I think yeah, a clear message there for international organizations that you, just because you can doesn't mean that you should. And it's hard to live out your values and principles, but if we are not doing that, then why are we doing this at all? You mentioned some really important points about risk transfer and where risk is held within the system, and I think many of us would recognize that the pandemic has accelerated this process of relying on local and national actors, and not necessarily for particularly noble reasons. They were pragmatic ones. But that does leave us with some major outstanding questions about how fairly risk is distributed in the system. And management of risk has been one of the barriers or excuses, depending on how you look at it, for donors in particular, in their inability to fund local and national actors directly. And we've seen, as Lydia mentioned, like I guess an ever rising bar in terms of the barriers to entry, to access funding, and an ever-growing burden of accountability requirements and policies and assurances for donors. And all of that places a burden on the intermediary, makes it more difficult to access funding for local and national actors. So I wanted to ask, actually, Sherwen, how your organization has dealt with this, because you have a really different approach to risk, which is much more, I guess, risk tolerant in the kind of popular parlance. You're much more flexible with your partners. I wondered if there are any lessons from your experience there that perhaps could help to reassure anxious international donors around what you might risk and how you might manage this process, or what you might gain in this process.
Thanks, Lydia. Yeah, I mean, I think first of all, I would reframe who is taking on risk in that question. I think funders like to talk a lot about the risk that we take on, but really there's almost no risk to funders, right? There's maybe your endowment size will shrink, maybe you'll make different decisions about how you allocate your money in the future, but the real risk being taken on is by people who are doing the work. Right. And so I think our team would argue that the risk is that in restricting your funding or by misallocating it, you are putting people at risk as they go about their work. And 100% of our grants are unrestricted to our partners to start with. But I think both Sudhanshu and Lydia were talking about and alluding to the fact that local partners are on the front lines of risk in almost every situation, and COVID has been an extreme lesson case on that point. While so many local organizations have been approached by international agencies to take on some of the toughest parts of COVID-19 work, whether it is community level sensitization, household mapping. But while they're taking this work on, the actual budget required to do that work safely is not being passed on to them. And community organizations and local organizations will still agree to do this work because it is their community, right? Because it is necessary. And that is fundamentally an abuse of power and, frankly, just a horrible way of working. And so I think in considering risk, though that is where we should be asking questions about risk and who is facing it. And I think from our perspective, our role as a funder is, first of all, to directly fund local organizations whenever possible. And in our case, we actually work with very, very few international organizations, because if the option is there to work with a local organization, we would rather have a direct relationship with them in terms of funding and communication. But then in the rare cases where we do work with an INGO that is coordinating with place-based organizations, we believe that our role is to make sure that the money is going to local organizations to begin with, and that their needs and interests are being equally represented, if not prioritized in conversation. I think, for example, when we've entered into co-funding relationships where there has been this type of arrangement, often the INGO will seek to go through or seek to subject local organizations to a vetting process, which alludes or which kind of harkens back to what Sudhanshu was saying earlier about people being really put through the ringer and degraded in the process of saying, okay, do you fit this requirement to work with us? Do you fit this requirement to work with us? And the response from those organizations is usually, our qualification here is that we are already working here, right? And in that conversation, local organizations, should be supported to say, well, why should we be working with you, right? Because we are taking on the risk operationally. We are taking on the risk reputationally within our own communities. What is the reason for us to work with this larger international organization? And usually the reason is access to funding. And so I do think the onus is on funders to correct that issue, because it's a fairly illogical bottleneck.
Thank you. So we had a comment from the participants, which I think leads us nicely into perhaps one of the final areas that we'll get through today, which is around access to not only funding, but also decision making and having real kind of influence over planning and prioritization. And I think this is an area which was largely left out of the grand bargain reforms. I apologise if you can hear noise in the background. That's my very naughty dog scratching the sofa. I wondered if you had some practical examples from your own experiences around what some of the most important steps might be to meaningfully shift power within the system. So not just the resources, but how we can meaningfully redistribute decision-making power and influence within the system. And perhaps, Lydia, would you mind starting us off?
Thanks, Lydia. Yeah, I think I'll speak to it in two ways. One is just in response to something that was said earlier by Sudhanshu around the nationalizing, should I say, or southernizing of INGOs. And this point that Shewen was making about, well, where's our space to ask the locals actually having the right to ask the questions, not the other way around. And I did want to just make a point there before I just go into my example from Somalia, is that the way we've increasingly, so when we started with that southernizing agenda, it was to some extent seen as a more mechanical thing. But I do think that over time, because of the conversations internally, because remember that also INGOs are made up of people and the people are more and more from north and south, and the southerners actually asking internally those questions to the rest of the system. A difference in approach that's emerging. So, for instance, if I look at, for instance, Oxfam Colombia that we started, that came from a deep process of actually discussing with civil society in Colombia what they wanted, because we had an Oxfam Colombia office. We wanted to be phasing that out, and we said, so what would you like to see of Oxfam in Colombia going forward, where we are now shaping a new reality that should be informed and shaped by what you would like to see and demand from us. And so the way Oxfam Colombia has actually emerged is a somewhat different model from some of the earlier ones, because it is a response to what civil society itself said they wanted to see Oxfam doing in Colombia. And I think if you're southernizing, there has to be a process of actually consulting. So, for instance, Kenya is going through a process where the main point is about consulting and finding out, A, are you adding any value add? Is there a role for you? What is that role? Or there's no role. In which case, Sudahansu, I totally agree with you. Then don't be there. If the people say, we're fine, thanks, we can manage, we don't need you in this way, we want you in another way, then that's our role to actually be much more responsive and listening to that and acting in relation to that. But in terms of the bigger question you're asking, I just wanted to give a very quick example, because I think um, there are maybe changing dynamics, if we don't want to use the language of shifting power, changing dynamics in the power relationship. And I think the crisis modifiers work that has been happening in Somalia with our team has been very interesting, because it was started by the local country program. It's not an affiliate, it's not a member, it's just an ordinary country program that decided that its approach to work in Somalia needed to be different. It wanted to work and be much more in solidarity with its local and national NGOs. And it works in that way through all its programming. So when I visit, most of my time you're spending it with young Somalis who are doing the most amazing innovation in IT and technology. You're meeting with different types of partners that are actually leading in the work, not necessarily ourselves. And our role is definitely to be a true partner. So the crisis modifiers work started by local and national NGO partners actually coming together with a specific exploration on their usefulness to support localization. And the crisis modifier was actually introduced upon partners' requests, who, unlike their INGO counterparts, were experiencing exactly some of what we've just been talking about, which is not being able to access flexible funding, contingency amounts in their budgets to rapidly respond when there was an emergency. The crisis modifier was a pilot activated for two crisis types, COVID-19 and climate shocks. It was designed through a process of peer-to-peer collaboration to develop the budgets, the application requirements, the project reporting templates and systems, improving local actors, agencies, to define the priorities with the communities independently of the INGO. So the INGO partners were not there in that process. It was the local actors leading in working with the communities to agree what the priorities would be. And it really did show that there are benefits of that approach in support of locally led action, with local partners implementing crisis modifier responses efficiently and effectively. So this issue that they don't have capacity, they can't do it, was shown to be a lie in crisis affected communities with minimal actually operational costs. However, it also found that NGOs or donors do have to have meaningful partnership models in place for this to really, for local and national NGOs to benefit, and if we're really going to see the power imbalances changing. So the crisis modifier is something that we think approach, which, as we said, started and initiated by local actors themselves, is something that provides an avenue around the nexus programming thinking, where we're talking about humanitarian to development and peace, and how you work across the continuum to actually look at how you're really providing more predictable, flexible, quality funding that is responsive and anticipatory into the needs that have been identified and priorities that have been identified by the people themselves, and that doesn't require such huge bureaucratic operational burden around it. Now, Oxfam's role in this was merely to be the broker, more funding from the Dutch Relief Agency for the Somali local actor platform, which is called the Nexus. The Nexus platform itself it's a consortium. It's led by national Somali organizations, and they are in charge. They asked Oxfam to be the fund manager. It wasn't Oxfam insisting. And it's really an example in the ways of working that are going on within that Nexus forum of a different changed reality where the local actors are demanding, doing, implementing, holding to account, and managing. And one of the things that also the supporting INGOs did in the background was ensure that they were not just looking at the money coming from the donor, but also how we were putting in that unrestricted money that Chewen was talking about to support them to become more institutionally strong in their own right. Now, donors go direct to them. So there are cases where donors are going direct to local actors because they are now organized. They're doing things themselves and they decide whether they want to partner with an INGO or not on a particular initiative. So I do think there are some examples there out there that are worth shaping, following. But the only challenge is, can we do it at scale is the challenge.
Thank you. Thanks for that great example. And Sudhanshu, if I could just ask you very briefly, 2 minutes, if you could give us some really quick examples of some important steps that you think that we could take to meaningfully shift power as well as resources within the system.
Lydia, as I already said, that shifting the power is not the term I personally prefer. Let me be very quick because time is running out. See, as you said while introducing me, that I am part of many global platforms of discussing localization, but I'm also a practitioner. During COVID-19 response, I was on the ground myself from the day one, distributing food, personal hygiene material, etc., taking all the risk myself along with my team. But when after a few months things started stabilizing, I was silently watching which are the organizations receiving awards. And it's all the intermediary organizations which have received awards for their exemplary COVID-19 response without being on ground themselves. It's injustice, and they shamelessly accepted it without ever acknowledging the organizations which actually earned them these awards. No, so this has to change. Be ethical. I ask intermediary agencies to be ethical and honest. Don't be exploitative in this. No. Second thing is that there is a strong disconnect between HQs and country offices. HQs talk, country offices don't even know, or if they know, they don't. They pretend that they don't know what their HQs are talking about. So there is complete difference between what HQ is talking. They talk about localization, and country offices are doing just colonization. So this needs to change. What needs to change? This entire localization discourse has added more burden, has become more exploitative of local actors. Now we are wanted in all the platforms to prove for local international actors that this platform was inclusive. So we participate, we don't influence. When it comes to decision making, decisions are still made backdoor, which suits this global powers. No, I can give example. Today we don't have time, but I can give so many examples where I participated, I shared, and see, no one pays me for participating in this. I participate because I want a system change. No, for doing the same amount of work, my northern colleagues get paid. But that is exploitation. I take my time out from my own organization to participate, expecting some change. It doesn't happen. So be fair to the time we invest in this process. No, one last point, and then I'll stop. Since we speak up, we face a lot of hostility now. Hostility from those organizations which hold the power. They want to remain unchallenged. So I face a lot of problems in India because I challenge this intermediary organization. And why should not? So whenever we talk about shrinking space, we often accuse governments for denying space to us. We don't look internally that how big organizations are becoming hostile, trying to finish off those local organizations which speak up, which challenge their power structure. And that's another area we need to look into. And if you want to sustain local organizations, most of the international organizations have become international and global confederation because they received framework grant, core grant. Start giving that to local organizations. Let them have the intellectual capacity to grow. if you can do that, that would be good.
Thank you. Some real challenges there. And I've really enjoyed the honesty and the very challenging language from this panel, which is a very different conversation than we would have had if the Congress had put together a panel of donors, I think. So a really refreshing discussion. Just any quick final points from you, Sherwan, on this, any kind of practical steps on how we can help to shift or redistribute power more equitably within the system, and then we'll wrap up the session.
Yeah, I would just say to anyone who works in funding spaces, start now and stop asking why, right? Because fundamentally it is the ethical thing to do. And don't necessarily put the onus on organizations to come up with an evidence base for why you should more ethically redistribute your funding.
Thank you. I think that's an absolutely perfect closing to this session. Thank you so much. And so thank you to our three absolutely brilliant panelists today, and to the organisers of this session. And thank all of you for dialing in and listening, and for your insightful and challenging questions and comments. So just to note that this was the last panel of this year's Humanitarian Congress. And so on behalf of the hosting organisations, just wanted to thank all of the speakers across the Congress this year, all of the chairs and the audience who have nudged and challenged us all with your questions. And a special thank you to the people who have been behind the scenes, who haven't been visible, but without whom none of this would have happened. So particularly our interpreters, the live captioners, and last but not least, hopefully I'll get everyone here, but Lena, Helena, Melissa, Leah, Miriam, Leonie, Clara, and Nora. So thank you so much to all of you.